Today's lesson is draping the straight skirt sloper and would be taught by Times and Trends Academy. Module 1. Preparing the dress form and muslin blocks. On your dress form, measure down 17.8 centimeters from the middle of the waist tape. This is your hip level. Position your style tape all the way around to the back, making sure the hip level is level to the floor. To find the length for both your front and back muslin blocks, measure down from the waist to the desired skirt length. Add 10.2 centimeters and record that measurement. To find the width of your front block, you will need to find the widest part of dress form's hip, which may be at the hip line or slightly below. Add 7.6 centimeters and record that measurement. You will do the same for the back. The next step is preparing your muslin's block is to snip and then tear each of your skirt panels according to your recorded measurements. Block both skirt panels so that your length and cross grains are at the right angles to each other. Make sure that you press your blocks in the direction of the grain so that your blocks retain their shape. Module 2. Marking your blocks. To mark your front skirt block, you will come in 2.5 centimeters in from the right side edge and drop a grain line down from the top. This is the center front. Come down 22.9 centimeters from the top and place a grain line across. This represents the hip line. Then measuring from center front at hip line, mark your hip measurements plus a 1/4 inch ease and square a line down to the bottom edge. This is your side seam. Next, measure in 5.1 centimeter inches from the side seam at the hip level, then drag a grain line up. This is a front guideline. From the back skirt block, come in 2.5 centimeters from the left side of the block and drop a grain line down from the top. This is your center back. Measure down 22.9 centimeters from the top and square a line across to form a hip line. On that line, measure over from the center back the width of your hip plus a 1/4 inch ease and then square a line down to the bottom edge. Come in 5.1 centimeters from the side seam, add hip line and drag a grain line up to the waist to form a back guideline. The next step is to prepare your back side seam. Add a 2.5 centimeter seam allowance from the hip line to the bottom of the block. Come up 5.1 centimeters from the bottom edge and draw in your hem fold line. Cut into the seam allowance at the hip. Then trim away the excess at the side seam below the hip. Repeat the same steps as you did for the back on your front panel, adding 1 inch seam allowance at the side seam. Add a 5.1 centimeters hem allowance at the bottom. Trim away the side seam excess. Clip into the seam allowance at the hip level. Take your back skirt panel and position it over your front. Begin pinning your side seam from the hip line all the way down to the bottom of your skirt. In preparation for draping the skirt, finger press your center front and center back seam allowance. Module 3. Draping a skirt. Begin the skirt drape by matching up the hip line of your muslin with the hip style tape on your dress form. Continue to pin along center front above the hip line to the waistline and then below the hip line to along center front to the edge of the torso. Take your back skirt muslin and position it at your center back hip line intersection. Once you have placed pins along the center back from waist to torso, you are now ready to secure your skirt to the dress form. At the hip line, looking through the muslin at your hip style tape. Starting at center back, place a series of pins by positioning them on the upper edge of your style tape guideline As you pin, distribute your ease evenly along the hip line of your muslin. Placing your pins in alternating directions will add stability to the area, which will help you later as you form your waist darts. Pin your side seam together above the hip line. Be sure that you balance your side seam grain, since if the skirt were cut out of stripe or plaid, they would need to match. Then follow your guideline straight up to the waistline and add a pinch of ease at the waist. Secure your guideline to the dress form down to the hip line. You will form 2 darts at the waistline. The first dart will be at the princess line. The amount of that dart pickup depends on the waist circumference compared to the hip circumference, but is usually about 1/2 inch folded of each dart. A small waist but big hip will result in darts that are bigger but shorter in length. Your second dart is formed halfway between the princess dart and the guideline. Next, finger press the direction of the darts. Pin your back guideline to the dress form the same as you did for the front, adding a pinch of ease at the waist. You will form 2 back waist darts. The first dart will start at approximately 2.5 inches from center back. Dart pickups is approximately 3/4 of an inch folded, but again that depends on your particular dress form. The second or side dart will form between the first dart and the guideline and should have the same pickup as the first dart. Then finger press your darts in preparation for marking. Last step is to release the waist by slashing into the waist guideline on both front and back. Module 4. Marking skirt. At the center of the waist tape, begin marking by placing a dash at the center front waistline intersection. Proceed to mark the waistline. Cross mark both sides of each dart. Continue marking the waistline until you get to the side seam. Place a cross mark on the side seam waistline intersection and then dot along the side seam at the hip line. Then finger press the dart pickup. Place a dot at the vanishing point of the dart. Cross mark the side seam waistline intersection. Continue to mark the waistline until you reach the first dart. Mark the dart pickup and continue marking the waistline until you get to the center dart. Cross mark the center dart and continue marking the waistline until you reach center back, where you will place a dash. Estimate the vanishing point of the back dart and note with a dot. Remove the muslin drape from the dress form, keeping the side seams pinned together for truing on the table. Module 5. Truing a skirt. Next, you are going to true the side seam. Carefully redirect your pins without separating the layers. Using your hip curve, connect the side seam markings. With your ruler, add 2.5 centimeters seam allowance. The next step is to trace your side seam using tracing paper onto the back of the skirt. Check that you have successfully transferred your markings. Trim the excess seam allowance and then remove the pins. In preparation for truing your front darts, lightly finger press in the direction of the vanishing point and then remove the pins. Find the center of the front princess dot and drag a grain line down from the top of the vanishing point dot. Do the mark for the side dot. This represents the center of the dot. Mark them with your pencil and ruler. The length of your dots depends upon the size of your dress form and the fullness of curve of the hip. For a size 6, the princess dot's vanishing point is approximately 8.9 centimeters long. The side dot is usually 1.3 centimeters shorter, but again, the length of your dots really depends upon the particular dress form. True your dots with a hip curve. Flip the curve in the same position for both sides of the dot so that your curves are symmetric. On your back, lightly finger press the back dots, then remove the pins. Find the center of each dot and drag a grain line down from the top. Your back dot length depends upon the size of your dress form, but the vanishing point of the dots should end at least 1 inch up from your hip line. With your ruler, mark the center of your dots. True the dots with the hip curve, again making sure that the curves are symmetrical. Before you can true the waistline, you must first close your dots. Start by finger pressing your back center dot. Pin it closed with the dot pick up towards the center back. Once the back dots are closed, proceed to close your side seam. Finger press the side seam, back over front and pin from the waistline to the hip line. Complete the process by finger pressing your front dots with the dot material towards center front. Once you have completed this step, you are ready to true your waistline. True your waistline using your hip curve and straight ruler. Make sure that you have a right angle of both center back and center front and the waistline. With your curve, connect your markings repositioning the curve to true the back and then the front. Add 1 inch seam allowance to the waistline. Trim the excess seam allowance at the waistline. The last thing to do is turn your hem up on the fold line and pin. Then pin your skirt back on the dress form, the way you draped it, and check it for fit. And this is your finished straight skirt sloper. Happy learning!